Hello, welcome to this Buddhism paper for 2.2, the Word of the Buddhism uh, video. And we're looking just here at a general introduction to the Tipitaka or the Pali Canon. So generally speaking, the Tipitaka is a vast body of literature. The English translation adds up to 1,000 pages. Look at this picture of this bookshelf. That's it. That's all of it. But that's not quite all of the canon. It's just the canon that has been published in English. It's about 11 times the size of the Christian Bible, or more perhaps, about the size of English Britannica. The Tipitaka are considered, perhaps by some revealed texts, or by others not so much. This is an interesting idea. Most Buddhists wouldn't quite see it quite like Christians see the Bible. The scriptures are not considered divinely revealed. Some consider the question over the status and authority of the scriptures as significant. They might, in certain later scriptures, be revealed by the Buddha, especially the Mahayana scriptures. But we can say at least about the early scriptures of the Pali Canon that they are viewed as the word of the Buddha, as in particular the Sutta Pitaka. The other bits, the Vinaya Pitaka, the Adhidhamma, or the rules for the monastery, and the philosophical texts. Before revealing his teaching, or the teaching, as recorded in the texts, he had to become enlightened himself. He had to be able to access these ultimate truths, these super knowledges hidden from most people, and therefore it could be argued that these are, you would say, revelations, because he is passing on what he has discovered through transcendent, supernatural encounter. Therefore they're highly respected. Typically they're not placed on the floor, but the Buddha felt that these were truths that were accessible to everyone, like natural law. Anyone could be an awakened one, and you didn't need to read about it. You could discover it for yourself if you follow the correct paths. And largely that's what he encouraged Buddhists to do, to test his teachings against their own experiences. Now the Buddhist scriptures fall into a sort of timeline that begins with the life of the Buddha, with his final parinibbana, his death. Then you have a first council that meets after his death, and then you have a period of memorization. Writing hadn't been invented, and it's not until 258 that Emperor Asoka starts to spread Buddhism outside India, and then Theravada develops, that we then have in the writing of Buddhism. It's not here, but it's on AD 29. We have the writing of the Pali Canon. We have the development of other literature. The Perfect Wisdom books are written, the Pali Canon written down. Buddhism spreads to China and East Asia. Mahayana develops. Then the life of Nagarjuna, and you have then the writing of extra texts, the Lotus Sutra, the Heart Sutra. Buddhism enters Japan. Songstan, an important guy, establishes Tibetan Buddhism, origin of Tibetan Buddhism. The Chinese begin to persecute Buddhism. We get the rise then of sort of warrior Buddhism, the life of Nichiren, and Buddhism declines in India, and Hinduism grows. China represses Tibetan Buddhism more recently. You on YouTube can find lots of people reciting the Pali Canon, especially the Dhammapada. The canon is generally called the Tipitaka, the threefold basket. And this name refers to the baskets passed on hand to hand by construction workers. And that's the metaphor for passing on tradition. The best known, perhaps, bit of the Pali Canon for most Buddhists is the Dhammapada. Lovely little collection of advice, stanzas, an anthology of maxims arranged in 423 books. And many of these are very memorable stanzas, some of which you'll need to know. Following the decline of Buddhism in India, the Pali literature is preserved in Sri Lanka. This is important. Sri Lanka has a very strong Buddhist tradition. And additionally developed this vast commentary and elaboration of the canon developed. And later times, the most notable Pali writer is this guy, Buddhaghosa, who flourished in the 5th century. So what's a canon? A canon of scripture just means the writings which have been recognized as having a unique authority by the faith community. In this case, the Buddhist Sangha. The writings are considered canonical. They represent the core and the source tradition teachings of the religion. As scripture or sacred writing, the Pali Canon has these 3 parts. But it's not the only scripture we have in Mahayana Buddhist, the Lotus Sutra and the Heart Sutra. And to a lesser extent, the Chinese sutras of the Pure Land Sutras. And we need to think about the various attitudes that different Buddhists have to different scriptures, thinking different ones are more or less authoritative. So the Tipitaka, the 3 baskets, known as the Pali Canon, have their origin in ancient India in the language of Pali. So the Pali Canon refers to the official scriptures that are recorded in the Pali language. It's mainly the language of Theravada Buddhism. The Tipitaka, rather than Tripitaka, that's Sanskrit. Tipitaka is Pali, refers to the Theravada scriptures. They were written on loose bark pages. I'll do another video on exactly the physical writing. It's just an interesting thing. And stored by pressing these together and then wrapping them in sort of wood and respectively in cloth. The 3 parts of the Tripitaka, the Vinaya Pitaka, which are the commentaries on how you become a monk and practice as a nun. The Sutta Pitaka is a huge section, long and short actual sermons of the Pitaka of the Buddha. And then the philosophical books written much later, 200 perhaps years after the life of the Buddha, the Hidamma Pitaka. These are the commentaries or the philosophical reflections on the Buddha's higher teachings. So generally speaking, we go back, we begin with the teachings of the Dharma of the Buddha, which were originally passed on orally. There was no writing whenever the Buddha was doing this, or at least very little. And the meetings of the Buddhists at special place during rainy seasons would be the moment when they would pass on recent teachings and reminders to others. So the Buddha would send out his monks as missionaries. They would come back. They would learn new things. This would continue after the Buddha's death. People were used to remembering things. This is just part of the society. Long before things were written, things were learnt by heart. Writing just wasn't common. Plenty of time in the rainy season for discussion. When was it composed? So according to Theravada tradition, the Tipitaka was composed during the first council, a few months after the Buddha died. However, there's much debate about whether the bits were added later, such as the 5th Nikayana. Certainly, Abhinadhamma is added much later and contains references to monks and nuns who lived after the time of the Buddha. So they're not written down at first, but rather they're memorized syllable by syllable, and this is because the writing had yet to be invented in India at the time of Asoka in the 2nd century BC. One of the lovely little bits is the Dhammapada as part of the Sutta Pitaka basket. This is used by all Buddhists, a lot of it memorized. It's said of the actual words of the Buddha, and it's argued in a sort of wisdom literature between the foolish person and the wise person who understands the path of the Buddha and Buddhism. It aims to win the reader over by Buddhism by logic, verse, prose, and clever argument. This is the main section you'll need to understand for the course, the Dhammapada. The first council that met during the rainy season after the Buddha died, given it around 483 BCE, Buddhists met to collect his teachings and agree on what he said. 500 senior members of the Sangha, the Buddhist community, made up what is known as the First Council. And he started to work through all of the Buddhist teachings to decide which ones were definitely taught by the Buddha, which ones not. And this work was confirmed 100 years later by the Second Council at Vassali around 386 BC, still memorizing and passing on by memory the Buddhist teaching. By the 1st century, canonization happens. The works that are collected and organized, canonized, these teachings became known as the Pali Canon. They're the main scriptures. They're accepted pretty much by all Buddhists to a lesser or greater degree, certainly by Theravada, who maybe less so by others who accept other works. Pali Canon is the Triptaka, and we have its writing then just 30 years before Jesus, 29 BCE. So the other scriptures include the non-canonical works that are considered of important teaching aids in Buddhism. The Questions of King Milinda is a famous example. Mahayana and Vajrayana Buddhism accept lots of other texts, as well as the Tipitaka, as canonical texts, as the word of the Buddha. They are written in many different languages, particularly Sanskrit languages. They're considered as newer revelations of the Buddhist teaching, still carry authority of the Buddha. Mahayana Buddhists would say that they're sort of secret teaching that was only later revealed. Theravada Buddhists would usually not accept these as authentic. Okay, listen again for another video on the nature and status of the Buddhist teaching.